Senator Ted Cruz from the great state of Texas. Mr. Cruz, thank you, sir.
Larry, always great to be with you.
Appreciate it. Janet, I can't help myself on this. Janet Yellen, ex-date, June 1st. Now, hang on a second. This is Janet Yellen, who said inflation was temporary, transitory.
Transitory. That was her beautiful word for it.
Then on the CNN interview, she had a famous, we called it the hostage interview, and she acknowledged that there was some inflation. And by the way, a lot of people think they're going to get through the June 15th tax date just fine. Yeah. And therefore, this thing could go on forever. I mean, what do you think about this ex-date business? Let's start there.
Oh, look, I think the ex-date is clearly politics. The fact that she said it on June 1, it's a nice round number. It sounds good. It's useful for the White House to scaremonger. You're a professional economist. The Treasury Department has always had a host of extraordinary measures that they seem to be able to drag this out for weeks and sometimes months. So I don't think many people think June 1 is necessarily a magic date carved in stone. But there's no doubt we're coming up at a point where the debt ceiling is going to face some acute choices. And so I'm glad that the House of Representatives, I think they passed a very good bill. I think they passed a serious bill that raises the debt ceiling but includes within it $4.8 trillion in cuts over 10 years. Mm-hmm. What I think the White House ought to do is accept that and agree to it. They're not going to. It's going to be a compromise, something presumably less than what the House did. But I think the House's position is very, very reasonable. And I think that's reflected in the fact that the American people right now agree with Republicans that we got to do something to rein in the spending we're seeing.
By 60, 70, almost 80% in some cases when you look at various polls. Look, I think that...
You know an amazing stat? 58% of Democrats think we need to rein in spending as part of raising the debt ceiling.
Absolutely.
So Biden is to the left of his own party as well.
So basically, McCarthy is winning all these political battles. Now they're going to play the hand out as best they can. I just think it's interesting. The crux of this seems to be a statement by McCarthy. We should spend less than last year.
Yeah.
Okay? We should spend less than last year. Now, that's pretty reasonable. Domestic spending has gone up almost 20% since pre-pandemic. Right. Defense spending, by the way, flat, actually down a touch. So why not try to spend less? We're in fiscal year 23. I think he's referring to 24, which starts in October. We should spend less than we have this year. That's the argument here. How's that argument going to play out? And I'm especially interested in what you think from a Senate perspective, because Senate's got to vote on this at some point.
So let's start with big picture where we are and how dire the circumstance is. In 2017, which is not very long ago, total federal spending was about $4 trillion. Total tax revenue was about $3.3 trillion. That means, doing some quick math, the deficit was about $700 billion. At the time, the debt was right about $20 trillion. Now, what has happened from 2017 to today? That's a little over 5 years. Total spending has gone from $4 trillion to $6.4 trillion. That's a massive increase. What's happened to tax revenue? So remember in 2017, we passed the tax cut. You were very involved in it. I was very involved in it. Tax revenue was $3.3 trillion. Every Democrat and most of the corporate media said, oh, you passed this tax cut. It's going to result in federal tax revenues plummeting and a huge deficit. Now, we know now as a factual matter, every one of them was wrong. What they said was wrong. Every single year since 17, total tax revenues have gone up. And in total, tax revenues went from $3.3 trillion to this year, $4.8 trillion. We've added $1.5 trillion with lower rates because growth matters. But doing some quick math, the difference between $6.4 trillion in total spending and $4.8 trillion in tax revenues is a $1.5 trillion deficit, which means the total debt went from $20 trillion just 5 years ago to $32 trillion today. That is massive. That is an order of magnitude. That is game-changing. And what the House has proposed is really very modest. The House has proposed that our spending this year should be the same level that it was in December of last year. 5 months ago. So remember, when you see Biden or when you see Pelosi or Schumer on TV saying these are draconian cuts, they're horrible, just ask yourself, in December of 2022, Christmas time last year, were you living in some Dickens hellscape where the federal government was anemically small and starving Tiny Tim in December of 2020? Because what the House has proposed is let's turn the clock back 5 months to where we were in December of 2020, and let's grow by 1% thereafter, and that results in saving $4.8 trillion. So it's a very reasonable proposal.
And this 1 year ahead should be less.
Yes.
Just 1 year less after a 20% increase in domestic discretionary spending.
Yep.
Really. I mean, it's not asking too much. Now, I don't know, by the way. I mean, the way this thing, I think McCarthy may get what he wants.
Yeah.
But I just mentioned that because that is the crux of the matter right now. If they can figure out these baselines, that's all McCarthy's saying. He's not going to get everything he wants. He's talking about getting 80%. You've been through all these negotiations. I've been through negotiations. The Freedom Caucus has been through negotiations. But that's his position. I mean, that's very reasonable.
Well, and I spent a lot of time with the Freedom Caucus. A handful of us Senate conservatives met every week with the Freedom Caucus, met every week with House conservatives. And we agreed, said, look, on this debt ceiling fight, we don't need to solve every problem magically and all at once. Let's make a major, significant step forward, start to solve the problem, and take an incremental approach. I think that made a lot of sense. I think also the fact that the House, that they were able to get 218 votes and pass it, changed the terrain. Look, Biden was saying he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't negotiate. The only thing he would take was a clean debt ceiling increase. And that was objectively unreasonable and quickly became untenable. He had to give in and come to the table once the House acted. I think that was a very important step.
Yep.
It's also worth noting one of the big sticking points, apparently, between the House conservatives and the White House is over work requirements for welfare.
Yep.
And you and I both know work requirements for welfare are incredibly good policy. They help people. Look, the dignity of work matters. You're not helping someone, trapping them in dependency and moving people off of welfare to get a job. Able-bodied adults, you're not talking people with significant disabilities or the elderly. You're talking healthy young men who are not working right now, conditioning their welfare payments on go out and look for a job and get to work. You are helping them, and yet the Democrats today are the party of, we don't want you to work. We want you to stay home. That's a fight. I think the White House is on terrible terrain because 60, 70, 75% of Americans agree work requirements for welfare are very good policy.
Just one other point on this. Well, two other points quickly, though, because I want to move off this boring debt ceiling stuff. Just I can hear the clicks.
To be honest, you and I both like this stuff.
I love it.
We're enough of math geeks that we do.
No, I live for it. This is the most fun I've ever had.
And your viewers know at night you do sleep with the federal budget. You call it your precious. So that's okay. That's a good thing.
Look at that. I got a lot of notes here. I think it was yesterday, might have been this morning, but for the first time, Kevin McCarthy put border control on the table for this deal. I just want to get your quick thought on that.
Look, that would be very important if you can make progress on that. What's happening at the border is massive, it is horrific, and it is caused by Joe Biden and this administration. I don't know if they're willing to give on that, but I salute the House for fighting for it. And I think we need to keep fighting for it and keep fighting for it. It's one of the reasons I've called for impeaching Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security, because I think we need to put the facts of this humanitarian disaster before the American people.
I am assuming that if the White House can make a satisfactory deal with the House of Representatives, that the Senate will find 60 votes. I mean, Chuck Schumer has been as quiet as a church mouse. Haven't heard a word out of him for a couple days, which is a lot, as you know. You don't think they'd block it, do you?
Look, if the White House cuts a deal with the House, I expect the Senate to pass it.
All right, good. I want to completely switch gears. I want to go back to the goings-on with the FBI and the travesty there. And my particular interest, Senator Cruz, is to keep the FBI out of the next election.
Yeah.
You are a lawyer. You have clerked for Supreme Court. You know a lot about constitutional issues. I thought subpoenas had the force of law. The House has subpoenaed the Justice Department and the FBI to release a document or a file of documents, 1023, I think the title is, that might well show Vice President and or President Joe Biden was involved in bribery, pay for play, all right? I don't know that. Those are allegations.
Yeah.
How can the FBI and the Justice Department say no to a subpoena, which is a matter of U.S. law, or is it not?
Because we tragically have the most partisan, politicized Department of Justice our nation's ever seen. As you know, the last book I wrote is called Justice Corrupted, How the Left Has Weaponized the Legal System. And it walks through how Barack Obama turned DOJ and the FBI and the IRS and the alphabet soup of federal agencies into tools to target their enemies. And it takes you through the Trump administration, where you saw this firsthand, the deep state, hard partisans burrowed into senior career positions and waged war on President Trump from within the administration. And now those hard partisans under Biden are out in the open. They are brazen, and they are politicizing the enforcement of justice. So we just saw testimony of 3 FBI whistleblowers in the House in Jim Jordan's committee, where all 3 of them talked about being retaliated against because they dared speak out against the partisan politicization and the corruption. It is horrific. And look, your question is, how can the FBI or the DOJ defy a subpoena? Because subpoenas are not self-executing. And if you have someone that defies a subpoena, the next step is to hold the individual or the institution in contempt of Congress. Remember, Eric Holder was held in contempt of Congress. But when you're held in contempt of Congress, that, too, is not self-executing. The next step has to be the Department of Justice has to prosecute you. And they won't. They won't prosecute themselves. Because they didn't do it to Eric Holder. So I talk about it in Justice Corrupted, how once Eric Holder was held in contempt of Congress, he was Attorney General, and the Holder DOJ said, nope, we're not going to do anything. And by the way, just a week ago, the Biden U.S. Attorney in Massachusetts, Rachel Rollins, resigned in disgrace. Now, Rachel Rollins is one of the leading advocates in the country of abolishing the police. She is the most extreme prosecutor that Joe Biden put as a U.S. attorney. She had been a George Soros DA. She'd put out a list of 15 crimes she would not allow her prosecutors to bring. She had effectively legalized shoplifting and resisting arrest and dealing drugs. Well, she resigned after an investigation from the Office of the Inspector General found she had flagrantly violated the law. She had committed felonies, lying to federal investigators. She had used Department of Justice resources to interfere in a Democrat primary because she wanted the left-wing Democrat to beat the more moderate Democrat to be her successor. The office that investigated it said it was the most egregious violations of the Federal Hatch Act they had ever seen. And the Biden Justice Department said just a couple of days ago, we're not going to prosecute it. Never mind that she committed brazen abuse of power. This Merrick Garland, John Mitchell is rolling over in his grave at Merrick Garland and just how partisan and brazen. And John Mitchell, as you know, went to prison for his actions as Attorney General.
Nixon's Attorney General. But McCarthy said he talked to Christopher Wray, the FBI director, and was promised that the subpoena would be honored and the documents would be released. And then, I don't know, the next day or something, the Justice Department says, no, they won't. And this is, I mean, they're just breaking the law. They're just breaking the law.
Look,
so, I mean, something's got to be done big time about this stuff.
You see it.
They're going to try to bust up this election like they have interfered with the last two elections.
They are blatant in wanting to interfere in the election. By the way, the Twitter files, you see that the FBI, the last election, asked Twitter, asked big tech, suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story. They wanted to engage in election interference because they wanted Joe Biden to win. And it is shameless. As you know, I do a podcast every week, Verdict with Ted Cruz. We do it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We just recently had Jim Jordan as a guest on a two-part series where we went into deep analysis of all of the evidence of the Biden crime family, of corruption, of potential bribery, of selling influence and access to foreign nations. And this Department of Justice is stonewalling and covering it up in a way that is really shameful.
Well, if you got something that's so important to hide, then where there's smoke, there's fire.
Amen.
And I think that's what's going to be proven at some point. I don't know when. Senator Ted Cruz, thank you for joining us on set. It's a great pleasure, sir.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Bet. All right, folks.